Well, good morning, Streakers. Hopefully, you're having a fantastic day, or a good afternoon, or a good evening, wherever you are in the world. We know there's a lot of you out there. Today, we have a very special guest, someone who, when we read his research, we were very excited, and you're going to find out why here in just a minute. This individual, he happens to be a professor at Clemson University. He has been studying for quite some time. He's got a BS in mathematical science from Clemson. He's also got a master's of statistics from the University of South Carolina and a PhD of business administration from the University of South Carolina. He's taught multivariate data analysis, marketing metrics, marketing research, principles of marketing, marketing management, and so forth. He also has been sharper of minds and creator of knowledge, award-winning teacher and researcher. He also has been the past Clemson University Faculty Senate President. He's been in the study abroad program leader, and he's a juggler and banjo player of all that, and proud father of Molly. Streakers, let's welcome to our podcast Professor Danny Weathers, and let's start streaking.
Thank
Professor.
you. Yeah, it's a nice summary of my life.
Yes. I think honestly, my favorite part of that bio was shaper of minds and creator of knowledge. You obviously, and from all that you've done, love being able to study and learn and have a passion for learning and then sharing that learning with others, which is so fun.
I do, yeah, and that's largely what we do. I mean, we as teachers, that's the shaper of mind part, but as researchers, that's where we create the knowledge, and and so that's what I do on a day-to-day basis.
That is wonderful.
Amazing.
Well, how did you get started in this pursuit of yours of being a professor and going down the educational route? Was this something since a kid that you've been always wanted to do, or how did you get there?
As a kid, it was all I knew. Both of my parents were educators, so I thought that was what I wanted to do. My original career goal was to be a high school math teacher and basketball coach, and at some point I realized maybe that wasn't the best route for me, and so I decided that I would go into being a college professor. And I like the research aspect of it. So there were things that I can do as a professor that, just is not what high school teachers do. So this is where I ended up. But after I got my PhD at the University of South Carolina, I taught at Louisiana State University for 9 years, and then had an opportunity to come back to my undergrad alma mater at Clemson University 12 years ago, and so I've been here since then. But yeah, I knew I wanted to do something in education, but it took me a while to figure out what that something was. But I've been very, very happy. This is a great job. Again, being able to interact with students and help them get where they want to go. And then also, like I said, the creating knowledge side it keeps it new and exciting. So that's really what keeps me going.
Yeah, that creating knowledge. It's such a neat environment to be in too, where you're continually working and moving and progressing and seeing others do the same. It's really neat to see. Well,
it really is, yes.
Yeah, we were really excited to come across your research because, as our audience knows, we love streaks and streaking. And so, streakers, I just want to read to you the title of the paper or the research that Danny has done. It says, "Defining and Understanding Commitment to Activity Streaks." Now, when we saw that, we're like, okay, this can't be what we've been looking at for such a long time. We were so excited. And then to realize that it was exactly everything that we've been studying. What got you started down this path of activity streaks?
Well, let me say the feeling was mutual. When you reached out to me about the podcast, I was not aware of it. And as I was listening to the past episodes, I thought this is exactly what I've been studying over the past 6 or 7 years. And so I was excited to listen to the podcast. And it was interesting that I was, in looking back through the podcast, there were some of the folks that you interviewed that I interacted with, like Mark Washburn, who's the president of the Street Runners Association. And, that group was very helpful. And Mark was very helpful with our research. But in terms of what got me interested in streaks, I was trying to remember what triggered it, but I think I read an article on Snapchat streaks and how
Yes.
um, primarily high school students and kids
Yeah.
were just really engaged with these streaks and the lengths that they would go to keep their streaks alive and just how long some of the streaks were. Um, and so I realized that it had some marketing implications and so once I became aware of those types of streaks, I think I just started searching to see what else I could find. And then there were just lots of anecdotal examples of crazy long streaks in a variety of areas. And for what I do, there's always got to be some applied, reason for studying something. And so I could see that there were marketing applications, but it wasn't clear to me how or why these things were a good marketing tool. And so uh, what I started doing was compiling examples of streaks that I came across, primarily online, but some I would talk to people who had streaks of football game attendance. They're just all over the board, and I started compiling these things. And so what we typically do is when we have a research idea, we start to share the idea with others. So it's usually in an informal setting. It might be what we call brown bags, where people just get together for lunch and talk about research. And so I started sharing the idea, and every time I shared it, people said, "Yeah, that's really interesting." But I think the most interesting thing about this project was it was probably the most enjoyable research that I've ever done. But it was
Really?
also, yeah, but it was also the most frustrating. And maybe
We understand that.
because I mean, you have over 200 podcast episodes about streaks, and I think you're trying to get a handle on what these things are and why they're effective and when they're effective, and that's what I was trying to do. So I think you recognize the challenge, but it was interesting because there are so many interesting examples of streaks, and just being able to learn about the streaks that people have. How they keep the streaks alive, what the value of the streak is. It was interesting from that standpoint. It was frustrating from a couple of standpoints. One, streaks are not easily studied in ways that I have been trained to study things. So I typically focus on consumer behavior, how people make decisions and judgments. And I typically do experiments or surveys. I do some statistical modeling. That's my expertise, but those are not things that are really good tools for studying streaks. And so it took me out of my comfort zone to understand what streaks are. So that was one thing that was frustrating. And the other thing that was frustrating is that it's such a big thing, a big phenomenon. Let's call it a phenomenon. It's such a big thing with so many different facets that everybody that I presented the idea to thought it was interesting, but they thought it was interesting in a different way. And so to come up with a research project that narrowed this down. We all want to save the world when we do our research, right? Huge implications, and that's usually not the best way to go. And so we had these streaks are such a big phenomenon, and they have so many different facets and areas of interest, and narrowing that down became very difficult. And so the way our review process works, we do a research paper, we submit it to a journal. It gets assigned to reviewers, and reviewers give feedback, and they make a decision about whether or not they want to publish the research. Usually you have to revise it in some way based on the feedback from the reviewers. That's a good outcome. But what we were running into was when we would submit it to a journal, the feedback that we got was all over the board, because this reviewer would think, well, this is interesting, and this reviewer would think, well, this is interesting, and so we couldn't really, they couldn't come to an agreement on what was most important or interesting about this from a marketing perspective. And so we eventually submitted the paper to the Journal of the Academy of Marketing Science, which is one of the top journals in our field. And when the reviews came back, they were very encouraging, because we got a set of reviewers that kind of saw the value, or they all saw the value in studying this, and they sort of agreed on what we needed to do. And so once we got that agreement, then we could work with the reviewers. We would revise the paper, send it back. They would give us more feedback. We would revise the paper and send it back. And we eventually got to the point where they said, "Okay, you've done a good job.
Wow.
We feel good about publishing this." But yeah, so it was a very frustrating process, but also a very enjoyable process at the same time. So you don't often get those types of projects still.
Yeah, no kidding.
So, yeah.
You know, something you said that was interesting as you're doing this review, and this is in Streaking, we found the same thing, is that everyone looks at it and says, "Wow, there's some really neat stuff there. That's really good ideas, and that's going to be really big." But it's not. But the frustrating part is we don't know how, and there's this idea that, wow, it really works, but we don't understand exactly why it works yet.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Go ahead.
What were some of as you were approaching this and writing the paper, what were some of the different things that people were coming back to you with saying, "Wow, that's really interesting"? Like, what were people interested in your research? What part was exciting for them?
Well, I think they saw, they saw the practical applications, the Snapchat. I mean, there are numerous apps and websites that use streaks to encourage behavior. There are a lot of, as you know, there are apps out there to
Yes.
encourage streaks. And
just a shameless plug for the Streaking app, which is out there. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, not shameless at all. So I think that people saw the practical applications, or the potential practical applications of this, and so that was really what grabbed people's attention. People immediately recognized, okay, there's something there from a marketing, from a business standpoint. But again, exactly what that is, and like you said, why it works and how it works, that was less clear. But some of the, I think, challenging things that the reviewers encouraged us to do, and let me say we had a very engaged review team at the Journal of the Academy of Marketing Science, which is really the best you can hope for in what we do. But some of the things that they encouraged us to do that were really challenging was, how do streaks differ from things like habits?
Yes, that is the question of questions that we have been trying to talk about all the time. Yeah.
And they were pushing us to do this because there's a lot of research on habits, and there's research on collections there. So people have done this type of research, and they were essentially pushing us to say, what's new about this, and why should we care?
Right.
And there's some very, in my view, very clear differences between habits and streaks, and between collections and streaks. And there are multiple types of streaks, as I'm sure you've come across.
Yes.
As I was listening to your podcast, one of the things that caught my attention was your introduction to your podcast, and you basically say, this is what a streak is. And I think you say there are, 3 laws. I think you call them laws about streaks. And that immediately caught my attention, because that's the crux of our research. What is this thing? And what creates a streak? And, why are they powerful?
Yeah. I just want to say I cried tears of joy when you did the difference between streaks and habits, because I've been trying to articulate and preach that for such a long time, that there is a real difference. And sometimes it feels like I'm not able to articulate it in such a way that it makes sense to people, or or that it differentiates in a adequate way.
And it's interesting to me that when we started, because our research was more personal research and anecdotal, like we stumbled across it in the sense of, hey, this has worked for us and got us to be doing things that we weren't able to do before. And I remember when we first started talking about why this was working, that was one of my first questions was, okay, we need to understand how this is different than a habit. And we spent so much time talking and reading and asking people and trying to understand that same question of, okay, how is this different and why? And I think partly because we had studied so much about habits, but didn't always feel successful in developing them. But yet streaking, when we started to set a streak, we could visibly and tangibly and quantifiably see results. And so we were trying really hard to understand how that all fit together.
Yeah.
Well, I can give you some insight there. So I want to preface this by saying there's no one size fits all answer for any of these issues. So when I talk about a streak versus a habit, or it differs from person to person, as I'm sure
Yes.
you recognize. So what works for one person does not work for somebody else. I know you interviewed Mark Washburn at the U.S. Running Streak Association a year or two ago. I don't remember when you did that, but have you ever read any issues of the Streak Registry?
I have actually. Yeah, I get his monthly, and I see the Streak Registry, and we actually, when we published Streaking, Mark and I talked about that, and he went ahead and put a spot in. I actually wrote an article for him on streaking in the Streak Registry that came out. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, good. Well, so you're familiar with that, but that was a great source of insight for me. And one of the things that I did from my research was to go back through the past, I think, 5 years of issues, and there were maybe 2,000 stories from streakers about streak runners about their streaks, and so it was a really good source of information. And I searched for the word habit. I just did a Control F, find habit. And there are a lot of people who do equate streaks with habits. So there's no doubt that when you think about streaks and habits and how they're the same and how they're different, for some people they aren't different.
Right.
But for other people they are. And it's a complex relationship. In some cases, people have used streaks to develop habits. And so they say, we're going to create a streak with the goal of having this become a habit. When we say a habit, it's just pretty much mindless behavior. It's just something, you get in the car and you buckle your seatbelt and you don't think anything about it. You're not thinking about, I've buckled my seatbelt every day for 5,000 days.
Right.
It's just something you do.
That's true. The mindless behavior. I love the way that you said that. That's it.
And it is. And some people, deliberately begin streaks with the goal of having that behavior become a habit. And so streaks can lead to habits. And that's the goal for that particular person. That they may continue to track the streak, they may not, but it really becomes secondary. And one of the things that the things that some of the streak runners said was, I think Mark would reach out to people when they were reaching their streak anniversary, just to see how they were doing. And some of their comments were, I hadn't thought about this streak until you reminded me. So they were running every day, but for them it had become a habit, and probably for better health. And then for other people, it can go the other way. People have habits of something, and then at some point they recognize that they've been doing this thing on a consecutive basis, and it takes on a life of its own. So it becomes a streak. And so the causality flows in the opposite direction. And then I found examples of people who never equated their running streak with a habit. They said, look, this is bigger than this. I mean, I have a streak. This defines me. Habits don't typically define people. You don't define yourself based on your habits.
That's a really good point. I hadn't thought about it in that light before. That's a really, really good point.
You don't, and often habits have a negative connotation, right?
Yeah.
A habit of doing. I have a habit of biting my fingernails, or whatever it is. But some people don't want it to be at that level. Don't want to equate habits and streaks, because the streak is a way to define you, and a way to, in some cases, provide evidence to others that you are who you say you are. Prove to me that you are a big University of Alabama football fan, Well, I've been to 716 straight football games, which some guy had done, or maybe more.
Yeah,
Yep.
Dick Coffey attended 781 consecutive University of Alabama football games. That's
Yeah, yeah. And so for him, I'm sure that was a way to demonstrate his loyalty and his fanaticism. And so that's the role that streaks can play that habits can't. It
Mhm.
quantifies your behavior, and if you need to pull out proof of, hey, this is who I say, I am who I say I am. I am a big football fan. I am a runner. I am a whatever. Here's my proof. And habits, you really can't do that as easily or at all with habits.
Right. That was one of the things that we stumbled across as well. And especially in areas where people wanted to grow, but it was more character development. Like, I want to be a kind person, or I want to be more honest, or I want to be more patient. Those characteristics that are very difficult to quantify and to show that you are working and making progress towards that. So I remember one of our first streakers, that's what she gravitated towards was this opportunity to say, I want to be a kinder person, and now I have a way that I can quantify that and show after a certain period of time that I am becoming a kinder person because I've done this. Her streak was to write a
to
note, to
send one
send a
thoughtful
note or
note.
thoughtful note to someone every day. And when she hit a year, I remember her reaching out to us and just saying, I've been doing this for a year. And just the thrill of being able to quantify a character trait, which is really hard thing to do, and to be able to say exactly what you said, that she felt like she could now identify as a more kind person because of a streak that she could prove and show, I've been doing this, I'm becoming more kind.
Yeah. And I found those examples as well. There was one survey I did where I just put out an open-ended question: have you ever had a streak of behavior, and if so, describe it? And there were people who said, I had a streak of being kind every day, and so they were trying to do at least one kind act.
Yep.
But you're right, something that's inherently difficult to quantify, the streak makes it quantifiable. And to that point, another way that streaks and habits differ is streaks provides a way to regulate your behavior, and by that I mean people want to keep the streak alive, right? You don't say, "Oh, I want to keep this habit alive."
Right.
Say, but the streak is something a little extra that serves to regulate your behavior, and so it doesn't for going back to the runner, just because that's the primary context I use to study streaks. But there were a lot of runners who said, "Hey, I got up and did this mile. I ran this mile because I wanted to keep my streak alive."
Yep.
And again, that's not something you say with a habit. So there's this thing now that is pushing you to do something that doesn't exist when you are talking about habits. You don't
Right.
have this clear goal, and the goal is to keep the streak alive.
Jeff is just so happy right
I'm
now.
speechless right now. I'm just going to say that because it's been something that I've been trying to define for quite some time without what you've done in the research and everything that you have with habits. Because one of the things that I got frustrated with, like you, when I started to streaking, before that, I did look at habits as a way to regulate behavior, something that you said, how do you regulate your behavior with a habit? And I think that there are a lot of people who want to do that, which is why habits are studied and researched so much. It's like, well, this is a way to regulate my behavior in a way that I don't have to think about it after a little while. And what I found was that as I studied it and read all the books on habits, that the behaviors that I wanted to have in my life to be the person I wanted to be, most of them would not go into the automatic category. There's a few, but most of them would not. For example, I want to be a writer. Well, to be a writer, I have to write. Well, to write, I've got to write at least a sentence. And so my streak became write at least one sentence every day. What I found was the habit is how I type on the keyboard. I don't think about that. That's mindless behavior. It's, whether I use my index fingers or four fingers and a thumb, that I didn't think about anymore, but it was an active, intentional, deliberate thought to say, I'm going to write at least this one sentence.
You're right on there, and I would refer to that as implementation intentions.
Yes.
And so you have to have a plan for implementing most behaviors that become streaks. And just to give you an example, like again, you don't have a plan for putting on your seatbelt when you get in your car, right? So that's
Right.
just something you do. You haven't thought it through. But there were numerous streak runners who recognized that their streak was in jeopardy if they didn't think through the process of making that behavior occur. So a lot of international travelers, when they would know they were going to travel internationally, and they're going across the international date line, or all sorts of things like that, they had to think about how they were going to keep the streak alive. And so they had to, how am I going to implement this behavior? And there were some who would, pick flights that would allow them to get their run in and then travel around the world.
I'm laughing because I've done just that. I've done that on my international flights. I have done exactly what you're talking about, where you're planning on how to keep that streak alive.
And you run the airport.
Yes.
Yeah, and I thought those were great stories, but again, that's a way that streaks and habits differ. You with habitual behavior, you just don't have to do that, but with streak behavior, you do have to, not on every occasion, but when you're doing something that's out of the ordinary, you have to do that. And another way that streaks and habits differ is habits usually it's an automatic response when you're in a certain context. And so again, going back to the seatbelt example, when you get in your car, you put on your seatbelt. But with streak behavior, that's often not the case. And again, I read stories of people running on a bobsled track in Norway to keep their running streak alive. I mean, that's you just don't find yourself in those situations.
No.
It's not like, oh, I'm here. I better my habit better kick in because I'm on a bobsled track in Norway. It's so they just operate at different levels, and it's just that extra bit of regulation that the streak provides that you don't get from a habit.
This is so much fun to talk to you because we've talked about these things so often, but the things that we would talk about were two things that you said that made me think of this is, one, you're exactly right. Habits were so dependent upon routines. And we really noticed this a lot with COVID, that you could have a habit and a routine of something, but as soon as that routine was taken out of context or something happened like COVID, where all of our routines kind of got turned upside down, then that effectiveness of the habit really went down because you couldn't rely on the things that you had relied on before. And that was something that we really noticed a lot, especially during those COVID years when we would talk about, wow, everything has changed, and what used to be done without us having to put a lot of thought effort into it, now we completely went without even thinking about it because all of those things that were in place that we relied on, mostly routines, had disappeared. And that's when we really started talking a lot about the difference between a habit and a routine and a streak, and where does a streak live in that world so that it can help us. Because I think one of the things that you said motivated your research was you were looking at it from a marketing perspective and noticing, wow, this is driving some behavioral change in people. Why is that? And we found the same thing in our streak, but we kind of were coming at it from the other direction where we were looking at saying, we want our behaviors to change. How can a streak help us do that?
One of the things that I thought was interesting was I didn't uncover any examples of somebody saying, I have a streak of brushing my teeth every day, as an example. People just don't see that as a streak. And I asked some people, well, why don't you have a streak of brushing your teeth? Why do you not say I brush my teeth every day for 42,000 straight days? And one person's response was, that's just something I'm supposed to do. That's just something, there's no question of whether or not I'm going to do this. It's just something I'm going to do. However, I will say that there was one example that caught my attention where someone said that they had a streak of showering and eating breakfast because they needed that whenever they were feeling depressed. And so when their physical, their resources were depleted, they needed that streak to push them to do something that for most people is just a routine behavior. And
Right.
so again, going back to the idea that there's no one size fits all approach for this, while 99% of people would never say I have a streak of brushing my teeth or taking a shower or getting dressed, for some people that is important. And so when people are dealing with depression or illness or whatever it might be, that streak for some people can push them to do that behavior. So it can be a very important driver of behavior for those people in those situations.
Right.
There is so in your research and in your paper, you have drivers of anticipated streak commitment. This plays a little bit right into what you were talking about, and you talk about three areas as far as individual differences. It's either you do a streak for identity relevance of the activity, self-improvement resulting from the activity, or personal need for structure. Talk to us just a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so what we tried to do with this research was identify why would somebody anticipate committing to a streak? Because again, that's what marketers want to have happen, right? You start the streak and you keep it up because that way you're engaging with the website, with the app, with the company. So that's the ultimate outcome. So what is driving this? Now, marketers don't have much control over individual differences. How I differ from you in terms of the ways I see behavior, the way I think. They don't have much control over that. But our view was that's really what is the initiation of commitment to a streak, is how people see the behaviors and see the streaks. And so there were, as you mentioned, there were three areas that we looked at that might impact one's commitment to a streak. And one was the identity relevance of the activity. So I think the important thing to do there is to separate the activity from the way the activity is performed. So the activity is running, the way the activity is performed is as a streak, for example. Or you could run once a week, or you could run, 3 times one day and 2 times a day, whatever you come up with. But we wanted to separate the activity itself. So how do people identify with the activity, and how does that impact their commitment or anticipated commitment to doing this behavior or activity in a way that is a streak? And so there were examples of people, again, I keep going back to the running examples because that was what I used a lot in this research. But there were people who said things like this: I never identified as a runner until I began the streak, or I've always been a runner, but I've never been a streak runner. So they separated those two things. So you can be a runner, but not a streak runner, or you can be not a runner at all, and then maybe you can use the streak to become that streak runner. So one of the things that we found in our research was the identity relevance of the activity does matter. So people are not going to create streaks for every type of behavior.
Right.
There were, and you've encountered this as well. But I mean, even though you may be prone to streaks and like the idea of a streak, it's just not going to work for every behavior. And so we were trying to understand, why does it work for some behaviors and why does it not work for other behaviors? And one of the things that drives that, at least in part, is how much you identify with the activity before you begin the streak. So if you see yourself as a runner, you're more likely to want to commit to the streak because it, again, cements your credentials as a runner. If you see yourself as a football fan, you're more likely to say, oh yeah, I would have a streak of attending football games. And so maybe that's a bit obvious, but we were trying to understand these drivers of commitment, and we were trying to separate the activity itself from the way you do the activity, because while it might be a subtle difference, it is a difference, and it's an important difference. Another factor that we considered was, how much why are people doing this behavior? And there are various reasons you can do it, but there are certainly a lot of behaviors that lead to self-improvement. And I think that's probably your perspective, right? You do
Yeah.
this behavior because it allows me to get better in some way, be a kinder person, be in better health, have better health, whatever it might be. But there are a lot of streaks out there that I can't see any self-improvement. Snapchat streaks. What?
There's nothing.
Yeah, there's nothing. So we looked at behaviors that might contribute to self-improvement, like running and walking and doing yoga and swimming. And we looked at behaviors that people have streaks of doing, but we couldn't see any obvious, benefits, personal benefits. So posting pictures, reading, visiting websites that are, not really designed to improve you in any way. And the basic finding was that self-improvement was a better incentive for creating a streak or committing to a streak than just something that seems fun. Certainly, the fun streaks can create a commitment to the activity, but self-improvement seems to be a bigger driver than just something that seems fun. And then the third thing that we looked at was, some people need structure in their lives and other people don't. And, I'm sure you see this. I don't know how your shelves are very neat in the background. Maybe you have a high need for structure. Maybe you don't. Maybe that's just an illusion. But
it's actually, I have a high need for structure, so
she
do
designed
his shelves. He has a high need for variety.
Okay. Well, the shelves are very nice.
Thank you.
But yeah, so you see the difference. Some people have a high need for structure in their lives and some people don't. And so what we found was that people who have structure are more drawn to streaks than people who don't need that structure. And because a streak provides structure to set of activities. Yeah.
Yeah, it really does. As you look at those three areas, and it's been interesting to us, the question I had for you is demographically. Like, for example, teenagers keep Snapchat streaks alive for their reasons. And then what we've seen, and I was curious, I don't know if your research went into it, but is that at different ages and stages, there's different reasons why they do the streak. The need for variety, entertainment, and so forth, more in the teen years, whereas you move up past college age. And it's interesting because we've been looking at this too, and we have, by the way, a huge amount of data that we'd love to, get into with you as far as through the Streaking app, all the different streaks that are created and when they create those and why. But what we found is in the college, it seems like they're improving because they're in college. And so streaks don't have as much of an impact. But then when you start to get into your post college, your after college, you're done with your educational experience, and you're now into your career. And this is one of the things we found in our demographics is people really start to take to streaking and the Streaking app and everything when they get past their 30s. In their 35s, that's when all of a sudden there's this desire or something that happens within them to say, wow, I need something like this.
Duolingo just released an article that they did on they did a demographic research of all the people that had kept a year-long streak on Duolingo. And did find that the older they got, the higher percentage they had of those people that would keep their streak for a year as compared to that younger group. And for different reasons, why they would keep the streak and why they were studying language too.
Yeah, so a few thoughts there. First of all, with the Snapchat streaks, just as an interesting aside, it was I talked to some people and heard some stories of kids who had super long Snapchat streaks, and they were often with a boyfriend or girlfriend.
Yep, that's what I was going to say. There's
a relationship. There's a relationship.
There's a social connection that's driving that. Yes,
there is, and and it was interesting that sometimes they would break up with the boyfriend or girlfriend, and they were more disappointed about losing their streak.
That is great.
Yes,
that was pretty funny. But yeah. So to your point, there's a social aspect of it there. So what some of these apps and companies have been very effective at doing is adding the social component. And so it's not just posting a picture every day, right? So I mean, you could say, look, you just have to post a picture every day and you can keep your streak alive. They say you have to share a picture with someone else. And so they've added that social component. And so by doing that, they've taken something that really probably doesn't have much inherent value, posting a picture, and they've added value to it by attaching the social aspect of it to it. And for high school kids, that's huge. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
as you know, that's a huge draw, and so for them, that has a lot of value. So if we look at it and say you're just sharing pictures, how valuable is that? Well, if that's the way you maintain your relationships and build your friend network, that's pretty important.
Right.
But I think, to your point about people as they get older, maybe are more likely to commit to streaks or to find this appealing. Some of that, I think, has to do with the need for structure in your life. So as you get older, you've got kids and jobs,
Responsibility.
responsibility. And so there's just a greater need for structure. So without, although we didn't look at this specifically, that would be my guess, is that it just adds that structure, that at some point people reach a stage in their life where they need that structure to engage in these behaviors that they know are valuable, and they just need that extra push.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
As you were doing your research, two questions I have is, was there something that surprised you that you found that you're like, oh, I didn't expect to find that? And then also, when you concluded your article, you kind of hinted that there was a lot more that could be studied. Is there, as you look back, is there a question that you're like, wow, I really wanted to study a little bit more and get this question answered?
There are a lot of areas that I would like to study, and hopefully I can find the time to get to that. But I'm going to back up a little bit. I'm going to give you some background, and it might help answer that question. When we began this research, there was people had studied streaks before. I mean, we certainly, I wish we could say we were the first, but we're not. But they had defined streaks in the past as, I'll read you the definition: a series of at least 3 repeated consecutive events or behaviors. And so that was kind of the working definition of a streak. And it was okay, but whenever I came across that definition and had found so many examples, my thought was, this just doesn't capture it. I mean, it's so much richer than this. It's not just at least 3 repeated outcomes or events. Now, people had studied streaks primarily in like flipping coins. When do you start to see something become a streak? And if you flip a coin and it lands on heads 2 times in a row, you think, well, that could be luck. But when you get to that 3rd time, people say, okay, now we're getting in something where this is a streak. So this is a little different than luck. And so that's usually when it kicks in. So that definition that had been used in the past was okay. But again, I just thought it could be better. And so a big part of our research was to get a better handle on what this phenomenon is. And I'm going to read you the definition. You probably saw it, but I'll read you the definition that we came up with, because it's pretty involved. But our definition of a streak that we developed from the sources of data that we consulted: a repetitively completed task attributed to the resolve of the actor, defined by absolute performance and temporal parameters, and construed and quantified by the actor as an uninterrupted series. All right, so that's how we're defining
I love that definition, by the way. That is such a great definition. Now explain it to all of us.
Now, I'll explain it. Yeah.
Break it down.
Here's how we arrived at this definition, and this goes back to your question, Jamie, about what did we discover that was surprising. So it was surprising because, again, it is a very complex phenomenon, and we needed a way to capture everything that was going on. Now, as an aside, I took this definition of a streak and I posted it on the Streak Runners Facebook page, and I said, what do you think of this definition? Does it capture what your view of a streak? And one of the funny comments that I got was, this is just a fancy way of saying that I run every day. Why can't you just say I do something every day? and that would be a nice definition if that's the way streaks work for everybody. But streaks don't work the same way for everybody, and so we needed a definition that accommodated all sorts of possibilities. So I'll just go through the definition, and then this will tie back to your question because it touches on some things that were somewhat surprising to us. So it's a repetitively completed task attributed to the resolve of the actor. So whoever is doing the task. What does that mean? Why is that important? Well, we uncovered lucky streaks. So we asked people, do you have streaks? And some of the things that came out was, yeah, I had a streak. I hit every green light coming to work yesterday, and I got a raise at work, and I got upgraded on a flight. And it's like, that's interesting, but it's not really what we're interested in, because that's not something that you can control. It's just something that happened. One of the things that's important in a streak, at least an activity streak, is that it's something that's deliberately done by the person with the streak. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. The next part of the definition, defined by absolute performance and temporal parameters. All right, so what does that mean? Absolute performance and temporal parameters. When you have a streak of behavior, you define what that behavior looks like. Now, it can differ from person to person, and it often does. But you have to have some bounds for that behavior. And if that behavior does not occur within those bounds, within those parameters, then you've lost your streak. And so, as an example, streak runners. Streak Runners Association defines a running as running continuously for 1 mile every day. And that's their rule. And so those are the parameters. The every day, you have to do this every day. That's the temporal, the time aspect of it. And then the performance parameter is you have to run at least 1 mile. And if you do those two things, then you perform the task as defined by the Running Streak Association. The interesting thing is that a lot of people modify these parameters. They say, that's not good enough for me. And some people run 8 miles every day or 3 miles every day. Some people refuse to run on treadmills because that's too easy. There's that, so the way they actually engage with these streaks and activities is very different. So although there are well-defined rules, people modify those rules to fit whatever works for them. But the other thing that's important about that part of the definition is we uncovered winning streaks, and winning streaks are also slightly different. Now, whether there are marketing implications of a winning streak versus what we call an activity streak, I'm not so sure. But we wanted to differentiate this because running 1 mile every day is different than winning every football game or race or whatever.
Sure is. Yeah.
And so what you have with winning streaks is your performance is judged based on how someone else performs. Did you score more points than the other basketball team or football team? Did you run your mile faster than the other people in the race? And so the way you perform that behavior will differ every time depending on how other people perform. So that was interesting, I think, was that there are multiple types of streaks, lucky streaks, winning streaks, and then what we're more interested in is the activity or behavioral streaks.
Yeah.
And so we tried to accommodate that in the definition. And then the third thing, it's construed and quantified by the actors in an uninterrupted series. So first of all, the quantification part. So I know in the opening of your podcast, you say, keep a record. Well, that's the quantification, right? That helps drive all this. So there's got to be that aspect of it. If you don't quantify it, it's a habit. If you just say, hey, I just do this thing all the time, well, you have a habit. You don't have a streak. But the other thing is that it's also construed as an uninterrupted series. In other words, the actor, the person doing the behavior, believes it's an uninterrupted series, and that's not always true. There were, maybe you've come across this example, but there was this guy who's eaten a Big Mac every day for 35 years. But there were 8 days where he didn't eat a Big Mac. The store was closed one day for a holiday. His mother died. I asked streak runners, can you ever envision a situation in which you don't run a day, but you still believe your streak is alive? And most people said, no, I can't. No. but 5% of the people said, yeah, I can envision that. If you give birth or break your leg or something beyond your control. So there are people who say, look, I know I'm supposed to do this every day, but there are things beyond my control that would prevent me from doing it. And I still believe I have a streak. And so a streak, while you can objectively say, yeah, that person has a streak or that person doesn't have a streak based on what the rules are, ultimately it's up to the person doing it to decide whether or not they have a streak.
So true.
So I think all of those things were kind of surprising to me, and it led to this long definition to accommodate all these possibilities. But again, it's a complicated thing, and we needed a way to capture these complications.
As you talked about in the introduction of the definition, a streak is so much more than what was the original definition, and so much more rich and significant. One of the events that happened as we were writing the book Streaking is I met a college buddy in an airport, and I was just talking to him about streaking and streaks and everything that we'd been doing, and the manuscript for the book was about halfway done, and I gave him a copy to look at, and he read through it, and he came back with a really challenging question. And he said, are you just streaking for streaking's sake? Is that just, are you just doing it to keep the streak alive? And where there are some that, you do it to keep the streak alive, what we found is that a lot of times, and this goes back to the self-improvement, but then also with the definition of the streak, is I have a difficult, what is it? It's an intangible person that I'm trying to become. It's intangible in the sense that it's an objective, it's something, but there's no demonstrable measurement that allows me to be able to say, I've become that person. And so what we talk about in the second half of the book is really a be statement. Who do you want to become, and who do you want to be? And then you align your streaks in that particular category. And that's what I look at for all the people that are streak runners. I want to be a runner, therefore I will have a streak to run. Now, that may not be, like what you said, true in all cases. However, those who really do want to have something that says, I am this person, take a look at how many days in a row I've done this. It's definitely a way to put structure around it.
It is, no doubt about it. It's again a way to demonstrate to others that you are, who you say you are, and again, the structure aspect of it is very important, because if somebody says, you tell somebody you're a runner, and they say, well, they're probably not going to say prove it, but if they do, how do you do that?
How do you say that? Right.
How do you say that? Yeah. So here it is.
One of the questions that I had too was, we talk a lot about community and how being a part of a community is part of what makes streaking successful. But you also talked about in your research that you found the difference between having a streak that was public and private. Can you talk a little bit about what your research found in regards to that?
Yeah, and you're right. There's value in having a community, and again, going back to the streak runners, if you look at their comments, many of them comment on being part of the running
part of the community. Yeah,
and that's an important aspect. So they like that social aspect. What we did in our research was we said, okay, suppose this website wants to encourage you to have a streak of some behavior. And it can either be public or private. So either everybody else can see that you have a streak and you maintain that streak by doing the behavior every day, or you can make it private. And what we found was that, at least for the behaviors that we considered, people were more likely to want it to be private. And so there was actually a disincentive if it was made public. And I think part of the reason for that was because people were concerned about how will people view me if I don't maintain the streak. Mm-hmm. In other words, if I begin this streak, a running streak, a streak of doing yoga, a streak of I can't remember the third behavior we used, but we said, okay, just imagine these behaviors, and people could know that you had a streak, or they wouldn't know that you had a streak. What would you prefer? And I think most people. What we found was that most people preferred not allowing others to know that they had a streak of this behavior. Now that's a different context, and when you will, willingly choose what, I want to run. I'm going to choose to run, and I'm going to try to have a running streak. That's a little different than the scenario that we presented, where we basically said, look, here's a behavior you can, or if you have a streak, do you want other people to know about it? And in that case, many people were considering behaviors like doing yoga that they wouldn't normally do, and so it's not.
Mhm.
They didn't really define themselves as someone who does yoga, and so they didn't want that information put out to others because it would serve to define them, maybe in a way they didn't want to be defined. But I think the takeaway from that is that in setting up apps and websites that utilize streaks, you don't want to just assume that everybody thinks this is a good thing, and that publicizing it to others is necessarily a good thing. So
Yeah.
And we found the same thing. The two things that we found was that some people would set streaks around things that were very personal, and they didn't want anybody else keeping track of whether or not they were doing that, but they very much personally wanted to keep track of it. And then we found the opposite side as well, that people would use making the streak public as an opportunity to kind of rally the troops. Like, I want people to know I'm doing this because then they're on board with me and they celebrate with me, and it helps me to keep that alive. So we did find both
we
scenarios.
found a third one though too, which is in between those. And this is an interesting one that I want to do a little bit more study on. But I started the streak as private. I started to have success, and now I want to share it because I've now passed a threshold within myself that I feel like I really want to celebrate.
Now I do feel confident to claim this as a part of my life, and now I can share it with people.
Exactly. Yeah. And I've seen that a lot too, where I start out private, but then I want to share it in a community because everyone will celebrate with me. I just hit 100 days of this particular streak. Yeah. I want to celebrate with everyone.
Yeah, exactly. And again, you've done it enough so that you feel comfortable saying, okay, I've had success, and this is now part of who I am. I think, and we also looked at that to some extent. In one of our studies, we asked people, would you be more likely to commit to a streak where it was presented as a 30-day challenge, or as a challenge to keep the streak alive as long as possible? And you see companies doing both. This is a holiday challenge. Oftentimes they'll have streaks that go from Thanksgiving until Christmas time and say, look, can you do this? Can you run a mile every day for 30 days? Or do they just say, hey, do this for as long as you can possibly do it and see how long you can keep it going? And we found some evidence, although it wasn't strong, we found some evidence that people like the idea of the 30-day challenge or a short-term streak more than they like this idea of just do this behavior and see how long you can keep it going. I think that was a little intimidating to people. Mm-hmm. And also going back, Jeff, to your comment, I think if you present it as a time-limited challenge and people meet that goal, then they feel more comfortable sharing it with people. They have something tangible they can point to. Hey, these people told me to do this for 30 days, and I did it, and I'm going to try to keep it going. So
yes,
yeah.
We've had some fun experiences too, where one streaker wanted to be more creative, but she didn't want to pigeonhole herself into one thing of creativity. And so she created a list of things that she could choose from that she could do every day, but not the same thing every day, which I thought was a really
well. And the streak was to review or do one thing from my creative list every day,
or add something to her list of creative things, and that gave her for the ability to have that be a part of her life, but not have it be so specific that she had to do this specific thing all the time. Yeah. The other thing I thought about as you were talking that has been interesting is we have a couple streakers that have used streaking to help them recognize that there were things they thought they wanted to have be a part of their life, but after doing it for a consistent period of time, they realized they hated it and they didn't want to have that.
I don't want to do that.
Which I thought was a fascinating aspect of streaking, to be able to, because there's a lot of times that we look at what other people are doing, or we read about something and we're like, oh, I really wish I was doing that, or, oh, I've always wanted to do that or be that. And through the streak, having done it, like one person did it for a full year, and it was coding. And he got done with it and he's like, I hate coding. There is nothing about coding that I actually enjoy. And I remember thinking, what a great thing to know. You don't have to think, oh, I thought I would like coding. I just never had the discipline to know. And through being able to set a streak, he was able to recognize, oh, I do have the discipline and I actually hate that thing. So I can let it go and not have any feelings of guilt or regret
Exactly.
because I found out, which I thought was a fascinating way to use streaking.
Yeah, well, and I had going back to your first point first about the creative list. That comes back to defining the parameters of the behavior. And so this
Totally.
particular person said, "All right, my parameters, my boundaries are anything on this list," and that was probably a smart thing to do because there were certainly examples of people that I came across that had defined their behaviors so narrowly that at some point, for example, going back to COVID. Somebody had a football game attendance streak. Well, during COVID, they were not allowing people
Not
into
allowed to
some
do
of
it.
the stadiums.
Yeah.
And he thought, well, how can I do this? So his solution was to go to the game. He didn't actually go in the stadium. He stuck his hand through the fence, took a picture of it.
That is so great.
So he had to change the rules of what it meant to attend a football game.
Mhm.
And so you came across I came across these examples of people just having to modify the rules on the fly. But you do want to think this through. And I think some of the streak runners, they recommend don't try to start a running streak of at least 1 mile a day until you can run at least 3 miles a day.
Yeah.
Because you're going to, if you can't run 3 miles a day, there are going to be days when you have trouble running 1 mile.
Yeah.
But to your, what was your second point? It just slipped my mind.
Oh, the one that the streaker that had used streaking to discover something that they didn't like doing. And I just thought the powerful thing was that they had done it enough to feel confident in saying, oh, I've tried this long enough to know this really isn't something that I want to do.
Yeah. Well, and I had a similar experience. So I'm athletic, but I have always hated running. And so it's just not something that excites me. But when I started doing this research and I came across a streak runners group, I said, well, maybe that's the problem. Maybe I need something else to motivate me. So I started having a running, a mile running streak. And my wife tried it as well. And I got out. And after a few weeks, I said, I still don't like this.
Yep.
Exactly.
Put me on the basketball court or a tennis court, but I just cannot deal with running. It's just not my thing. And so, very similar experience. The streak really allowed me to recognize that this is just not my thing. I felt like I gave it a reasonable effort.
Yep.
Maybe if I got up to a year, maybe I would feel differently. But after a few weeks, it just wasn't the thing for me.
We had, and speaking of that, and unfortunately we're coming up on time, but we have a streaker, really good. Actually, he's our chief marketing officer, Talon. He tried the running streak and didn't like it. And so he moved his to sweat at least one time daily.
Okay.
So you look at the parameter, I'm just going to sweat at least one time daily. And he has a whole variety of ways. One of the things, though, that he did, creative ways to keep it alive, his talent said, one time, for whatever reason, I just couldn't get exercising, whatever. So he ate a jalapeno that caused him to sweat. So
Streak alive.
Streak stays alive.
And those are the types of stories that have really made this a great project. Was just hearing those types of examples and some of the amazing things that people have done. And certainly the super long streaks are impressive. Just everything to fall into place, to run every day for 50 plus years, or to attend every football game for 70 plus years. And there was one guy who attended 797 straight Southern Cal football games. Wow. And he died in the parking lot during the Southern Cal UCLA game one year.
Wow.
The streak. And I thought that was, I'm sorry he died, but that was very poetic.
Yeah.
He went out doing what he wanted to do.
He was where he wanted to be, obviously.
But you just have all these amazing examples. I was really impressed with Meg Rohr. Have you come across her? She surfed every day for 7 years.
Yes.
I don't know if the streak is still alive, but I just thought that was really incredible to be able to, and something that I think I would love to do if I could. I'm not a great surfer, but just being out on the water. But every day for 7+ years. I don't know if her streak is still alive or not, but to pull that off is just absolutely incredible. I mean,
It really is.
how do you make that work? I don't know if I could do it.
They become very intentional and very creative.
And deliberate and planning and all those things. Well, Streakers, we've been talking with Professor Danny Weathers, and it has been absolutely a joyful opportunity to talk with you. And we hope that you'll come back on with us because there is so much more to discuss and to get into. Streakers, if you have any questions or would like to reach out to us, please do so via email, Jeffrey, Jeffery, at thestreakingapp.com or
Jamie, Jami, at thestreakingapp.com.
You can always download the Streaking app and see all kinds of streaks. One of the things that is on the Streaking app is the Discover page, and you can see all the streaks that people have made public. You can keep your streaks private as well. And then also there's the opportunity to look at the Celebrate with Others in the community, and there's several communities that are out there. Well, Professor Weathers, thank you so much for joining us today. We are so glad that you did this research and hope that it continues and that we get to have you back on.
This opportunity, this was the first podcast for me, so this is an exciting experience for multiple reasons.
Well, you're a natural at it, and we look forward to having you back on again. Streakers, as we always say at the end of every podcast,
keep streaking.
Better you.